Normandy, June 1944. The rain falls in sheets over the hedgerows. Inside a concrete bunker near St. Lo, the air crackles with panic. A German communications officer leans over his radio set, shouting into the static. Nothing answers. The signal lamps flicker. The phones are dead. Around him, maps flutter in the damp wind, as field telephones emit only a low, haunting hum. Across the line, an entire Panzer Division waits, blind, silent, frozen. Orders are not coming through. The division commander paces, unaware that, somewhere above the clouds, a formation of Allied aircraft hums with quiet purpose, transmitting not bombs but silence. The Germans had trusted their machines, the intricate receivers, the flawless wiring, the precise logic of their scientists. For years, they had laughed at American electronics, calling them crude, overbuilt, inefficient. But in this moment, their perfect science collapses into noise. The signal that once connected armies now dissolves into emptiness. And on the other side of the channel, in a dimly lit laboratory, a group of American engineers watches an oscilloscope line flatten to zero. They have just erased a division without firing a single shot. The age of invisible warfare has begun. At the dawn of the Second World War, Germany stood at the pinnacle of scientific and technological confidence. In the laboratories of Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich, the Reich's physicists and engineers worked with an almost arrogant precision. Men who believed that German science was unmatched, untouchable, and unquestionably superior. They had reason to think so. In 1939, the German military already possessed some of the most advanced electronic systems on Earth. Their early warning radar network, the Freya system, stretched along the North Sea coast, capable of detecting aircraft over 100 kilometers away. The Würzburg radar, a smaller but far more accurate cousin, guided flak batteries with deadly precision. Combined with the Enigma encryption machine, a marvel of mechanical complexity. These tools made the Wehrmacht's communication and detection systems seem years ahead of any Allied counterpart. British and American intelligence analysts were stunned by the speed at which German technology was evolving. Reports from 1940 and 1941 described the Reich's radar as scientifically disciplined and technically elegant. To the outside world, it seemed as if Germany had truly unlocked the mathematics of modern war. The Allies, by contrast, stumbled through their early experiments. The United States in particular lagged behind. In 1940, American military communications still relied on bulky vacuum tube sets that overheated and failed under field conditions. Radar research existed only in small, underfunded programs scattered across universities. The British, under constant attack during the Blitz, pleaded for American industrial support, but received little more than spare parts and goodwill. The German physicists were aware of this imbalance and mocked it. At engineering symposia, senior researchers like Dr. Wilhelm Runge of Telefunken dismissed American equipment as primitive and inefficient. They laughed at the size of U.S. transmitters, the wasteful use of power, the clumsy tuning coils. In their view, American engineers were not scientists, merely electricians with uniforms, but what the Germans failed to see was that their very perfectionism, their insistence on precision and theoretical purity, was about to become their greatest weakness. While Germany refined elegant devices, the United States began to build experimental ones. Instead of focusing on perfection, American scientists sought scale and adaptability. Under the newly formed National Defense Research Committee, industrial laboratories at General Electric, RCA, and Bell Labs were tasked with one mission: to close the technological gap with Germany at any cost. This mission would lead to the creation of the MIT Radiation Laboratory, a secretive facility established in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1940. Inside its walls, Hundreds of physicists and engineers began working on the next generation of radar, using short, ultra-high-frequency microwaves generated by a mysterious British invention known as the cavity magnetron. The magnetron, smuggled across the Atlantic under the top-secret teasered mission, could produce radar signals 1,000 times more powerful than anything the Germans possessed. It was a compact, almost brutal piece of engineering, crude in design but astonishing in performance. For the first time, radar could be fitted into aircraft, enabling Allied bombers to detect ships, submarines, and even terrain through fog and darkness. While the Germans continued refining their elegant but limited radio sets, American scientists were learning to bend the invisible spectrum itself. By 1942, the tide of scientific momentum had begun to shift. The United States now possessed not just laboratories but entire industries devoted to electronics. Thousands of young engineers, many recruited straight from universities, worked day and night developing oscillators, amplifiers, and jamming devices. Funding was unlimited, secrecy absolute. Yet even as American technology surged, the Germans remained confident. Their military engineers believed that their command networks were shielded by superior encryption and frequency discipline. No one in Berlin imagined that the enemy might one day strike not with artillery, but with interference, an attack that would not destroy radios, but render them deaf. The invisible front was forming, a war not of tanks or planes, but of waves, pulses, and silence. And in laboratories across the United States, the first sparks of that counterattack were already flickering to life. By the summer of 1943, the Allied electronic revolution was in full motion. What began as a handful of theoretical experiments inside the MIT Radiation Laboratory had become a continent-spanning network of innovation. Thousands of scientists worked under total secrecy, scattered across campuses and defense plants from Massachusetts to California. Their research, backed by billions of dollars in war funding, had one aim: to break the German grip on the electromagnetic spectrum. The Americans understood something the Germans did not. War was no longer fought only with steel and firepower, but with information and interruption. Every gun, every bomb, every movement depended on signals. Radio frequencies that coordinated divisions, guided bombers, and linked commanders to the field. Disrupt those signals, and an army could collapse into chaos without a single bullet fired. At the center of this silent revolution stood a new generation of American scientists. Figures like Vannevar Bush, Alfred Loomis, Lee Dubridge, and Ernest Lawrence, men who had traded chalkboards for command posts, envisioned a world where physics itself could become a weapon. Their laboratories produced strange devices: microwave jammers that could blind radar, transmitters that flooded enemy frequencies, and reflective strips of aluminum foil that confused detection screens. That last invention, codenamed Window by the British and later called Chaff by the Americans, was deceptively simple. Clouds of thin aluminum strips dropped from bombers. On German radar, they appeared as hundreds of phantom aircraft. Entire bomber groups vanished and reappeared like ghosts. German operators, accustomed to precise radar returns, suddenly found their screens filled with meaningless echoes. Freya and Würzburg, once the pride of German air defense, became instruments of confusion. But radar deception was only the beginning. The next step was offensive electronic warfare, deliberate jamming of German communications on the battlefield. At Fort Monmouth and Wright Field, military engineers began constructing compact transmitters that could be mounted on trucks, ships, and aircraft. These devices emitted controlled bursts of noise at specific frequencies, overpowering enemy signals. Unlike the refined precision of German electronics, American jammers were rugged and brute force, crude power against delicate order. By 1944, the Allies had established specialized units trained in countermeasures, Some were attached to bomber commands, others to naval fleets, and a select few operating under extreme secrecy, prepared for use in land operations in Western Europe. Their mission: to turn the German advantage in radio coordination into a vulnerability. In the months leading to the Normandy invasion, these teams tested jamming systems against mock enemy networks along the English coast. Aircraft flew over the Channel, transmitting on frequencies mimicking those used by the Wehrmacht. Ground stations in France, unaware of the tests, often reported signal distortion or ghost transmissions, early signs that the Americans were learning to reach deep behind enemy lines without ever crossing them. Meanwhile, in Germany, the scientific community still viewed jamming as a crude trick. Reports of interference were dismissed as atmospheric noise or operator error. The Reich's technical bureaucracy was slow, rigid, and hierarchical, unable to adapt as quickly as the improvisational, industrial chaos of the American war machine. And as D-Day approached, this gap between confidence and reality widened. American and British countermeasure teams coordinated to ensure that during the invasion, German radar along the French coast would be effectively blinded. On the night of June 5th, as Allied paratroopers crossed the Channel, aircraft deployed chaff corridors, vast shimmering curtains of metal that made the radar picture indecipherable. Freya stations reported hundreds of false contacts. Command posts received conflicting data. To the German High Command, it appeared as if the Allies had launched diversionary feints everywhere at once. Their sophisticated detection network, once hailed as infallible, became a source of confusion. But one more layer of the plan remained hidden: a new form of jamming, still untested in combat, capable of disrupting not just radar, but radio command itself. It was simple, brutal, and utterly devastating when unleashed, and when it was finally used. Weeks later, deep in Normandy, an entire German division would find itself cut off, leaderless and blind in the fog of static. In the first half of the war, German scientists had become symbols of precision and mastery. Men like Dr. Rudolf Kuhnhold, Hans Hollmann, and Ernst von Handel were celebrated figures, technical visionaries whose inventions powered the Reich's military superiority. They saw themselves not as servants of war, but as engineers of destiny. Their laboratories in Berlin and Darmstadt were temples of controlled genius, sterile, immaculate, and filled with instruments that hummed with mathematical perfection. Yet beneath that confidence was a fatal flaw: faith in the system itself. Many German scientists believed that the logic of their machines reflected the logic of the world. If the circuits were perfect, if the mathematics was pure, then the results must be absolute. They laughed at the crude improvisations of their enemies. American field radios lashed together with rubber tubing, their oscillators overheating in the desert sun. To German eyes, this was the difference between craftsmanship and chaos. But war does not reward elegance. It rewards adaptability. On the American side, the human story was the opposite. In places like Cambridge, Pasadena, and Dayton, engineers worked not in marble institutes, but in repurposed gymnasiums, barns, and factory basements. Oscilloscopes sat beside coffee tins. Chalk equations covered walls scarred by cigarette smoke. The men who worked there were not military heroes. They were mathematicians, radio hobbyists, and recent graduates barely out of their 20s. They built equipment with whatever materials they had. They tested theories by trial and error, burning out circuits nightly. But they learned fast. Every failure became a blueprint for improvement. And unlike their German counterparts, they shared data freely, across teams, across nations, across the Atlantic. While the Reich's scientists guarded their knowledge behind layers of hierarchy, American engineers built a network, a living organism of collaboration that grew faster than any one laboratory. It was a quiet revolution of minds, born not from arrogance, but from necessity. And when the time came to turn science into a weapon, that humility would become their greatest strength. The war for Europe would ultimately depend on who could control the air between the air, the invisible realm of frequencies and pulses. Germany had entered this domain early. Its Freya radar, developed by the firm GEMA in the late 1930s, operated around 125 Wellenfrequenzen, an impressive achievement for its time. It could detect aircraft nearly 100 miles away, giving the Luftwaffe the early warning edge that devastated Allied bombers in the early years of the war. The Würzburg radar, introduced in 1940, provided even tighter accuracy for flak batteries. But the German approach to technology was linear. Each new system was a refinement of the last, more precise, more efficient, but still bound by the same principles. Their scientists aimed for perfection in design, not disruption in concept. The Allies took a different route. The British discovery of the cavity magnetron and the Americans' industrial scaling of it changed the laws of radar. It moved detection into the centimeter wavelength, where devices could be smaller, more portable, and harder to detect. Suddenly, radar could travel with bombers. Fighters could track targets independently. Ships could see through fog and darkness, and beyond detection came deception. When Allied aircraft dropped bundles of chaff, they weren't just hiding themselves. They were weaponizing German precision against itself. The radar that once guided anti-aircraft batteries now showed hundreds of false targets. The same perfection that once gave Germany dominance now became its weakness. American scientists pushed further, creating jammers that could emit powerful noise across German radio bands. Devices like the AN/APT-3, known to crews as Carpet, and the AN/MPG-1 ground jammers filled the airwaves with static so dense that enemy operators couldn't distinguish signal from interference. To the Germans, the world began to sound like chaos. Frequencies that once carried orders now screamed with noise. But what truly frightened them was that they couldn't trace it. The interference came from everywhere and nowhere, from aircraft miles above, from ships offshore, from hidden transmitters embedded with advancing Allied troops. The battlefield was no longer just physical. It was spectral, a landscape of invisible combat where victory belonged to whoever could control the silence. The German military prided itself on order, hierarchy, and discipline. Commands flowed down clean lines, from headquarters to corps, from corps to divisions, from divisions to field units. Every order relied on precise transmission, every operation on timing and coordination. When those lines began to fail, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a breakdown of identity. Officers in France and Belgium reported strange disturbances in radio networks. Messages arrived garbled, delayed, or missing entirely. Technicians blamed humidity, batteries, or terrain. But as the disturbances grew, whispers began to spread through command posts that the Allies had found a way to poison the air. For soldiers trained to trust the infallibility of German science, the idea was unthinkable. Yet, as the static thickened and messages vanished into noise, panic seeped into the system. Commanders hesitated. Orders were repeated, then contradicted. Entire units waited in silence for instructions that never came. The most devastating weapon of all was uncertainty. And in the coming months, that uncertainty would culminate in a single event, when one American signal would plunge an entire German division into total isolation. By early 1944, the Allies understood that control of the electromagnetic spectrum could decide entire battles. The tactical use of jamming evolved from a laboratory experiment into a coordinated combat discipline. In England, teams of physicists, airmen, and engineers trained under extraordinary secrecy. Their briefings carried the code name Countermeasures Service, a bland title hiding one of the most complex operations of the war. They studied captured German equipment, tested its frequency bands, and built transmitters that could overpower them. The principle was simple. The stronger signal wins. Mounted on aircraft, these jammers could drown out radar emissions from Würzburg and Freya stations, making incoming bombers effectively invisible. On the ground, mobile transmitters known as jackal or carpet units could block entire ranges of radio communication, forcing enemy units to rely on runners or visual signals. This wasn't theory anymore. It was field warfare conducted by scientists. During the Normandy invasion, these systems operated in unison for the first time. Aircraft flying off the French coast emitted interference designed to mimic phantom fleets, while others jammed the radar stations covering the real beaches. The deception was so effective that for hours, German coastal batteries fired at empty sea. But beyond D-Day, the same concept was refined into tactical battlefield jamming, a more dangerous, unpredictable form of electronic combat. In the weeks after the landings, as Allied troops fought their way inland through Normandy's hedgerows, small American units deployed portable jammers to disrupt German communication networks. The devices were heavy and temperamental, powered by noisy generators, but their effect was astonishing. Whole battalions would suddenly lose contact with headquarters. Orders would vanish mid-transmission. At first, German officers thought the problem lay in equipment damage or terrain interference. They had no idea that invisible beams of electromagnetic noise were cutting their lifelines in real time. And when these jammers were coordinated from air and ground simultaneously, the results were catastrophic. The Germans, masters of tactical precision, were reduced to blind improvisation. In a war that prized control, the Allies had discovered the power of confusion itself. Inside the German command structure, reports of signal interference multiplied through the summer of 1944. At first, High Command dismissed them as operator error. The Wehrmacht's signals branch, Nachrichtenwesen, was convinced that Allied air superiority, not jamming, was responsible for communication failures. But field reports told another story. Entire corps networks were collapsing for hours at a time. Radio operators described strange, rhythmic pulses that overrode transmissions, a sound like a heartbeat beneath the static. No amount of frequency changing or retuning solved it. Captured German documents later revealed just how confused their analysts were. Engineers believed the disturbances came from natural magnetic anomalies or solar activity. Some even suspected sabotage within their own ranks. Few dared to suggest that the Allies might have developed a deliberate method of blocking communication itself. By autumn 1944, evidence became undeniable. Luftwaffe radar posts were failing simultaneously across France. Coastal defenses went dark at the same hour every night. Army communications near Caen and Falaise repeatedly collapsed during American bombing raids, even when no aircraft were directly overhead. Still, German leadership clung to denial. Admitting that their communication systems could be defeated was unthinkable. It would mean acknowledging that the entire doctrine of centralized command was vulnerable. And so they chose not to believe. Instead, they doubled down on secrecy. Orders were sent by courier, encrypted messages delayed for hours. This only made the confusion worse. The same rigid hierarchy that had once made the German army efficient now made it brittle, incapable of improvising when its communications went dark. The Americans had not just jammed their radios, they had jammed their thinking. Electronic warfare carried no glory. It had no medals, no parades, no battlefield photographs. Its victories were measured in confusion, not courage. Yet behind every moment of chaos on the German side, there stood a handful of engineers listening to silence, knowing that their work had severed an enemy's lifeline. It was a strange kind of warfare, one fought without death, yet filled with consequence. Every successful jamming operation meant fewer shells fired, fewer soldiers reaching the front, fewer coordinated defenses. And yet, For the scientists involved, there was an unease. The moral weight of unseen destruction, disabling human coordination without direct confrontation, left some questioning what kind of war they were creating. The age of the battlefield as a visible arena of honor was ending. In its place rose an invisible domain where the victors were those who could manipulate reality itself. Light, sound, and communication. This silent power would define not just the remainder of World War II, but the century that followed, and it was about to reveal its most decisive moment when a single, perfectly tuned signal plunged an entire German division into isolation and panic. Normandy, July 1944. The hedgerows were burning. Fields once rich with wheat now stood as twisted walls of smoke and shattered earth. The German 7th Army, tasked with halting the Allied breakout from the beaches, was stretched to its limits. Among its core units was the Panzer Lehr Division, an elite formation of tanks and mechanized infantry commanded by General Fritz Bayerlein, one of the Wehrmacht's most capable tacticians. Bayerlein's men were veterans, armed with the best equipment Germany could field: Panther and Tiger tanks, self-propelled guns, and radio systems designed for precise, coordinated maneuvers. Each vehicle carried multiple transmitters and receivers, allowing commanders to issue orders across kilometers of terrain with clockwork efficiency. It was this efficiency, this synchronization, that made German armored units so feared. But that efficiency was about to vanish. On the morning of July 10, 1944, as clouds gathered over the battlefield west of St. Lo, the Panzer Lehr Division began to regroup after a night of Allied bombardment. The order came from higher command: reposition the armor to counter an expected American thrust from the south. Communications officers relayed the frequencies, confirming the encrypted channels. Everything was routine, until, abruptly, it wasn't. At 08:12 hours, the division's primary radio net filled with noise. It wasn't the usual static. Operators described it later as a metallic roar, pulsing and uneven, like an engine throttling in mid-air. No signals could cut through it. Repeated attempts to switch frequencies failed. The interference followed them. Within minutes, the entire command network, from forward tanks to divisional HQ, went silent. Panic spread quickly. Bayerlein's staff assumed enemy artillery had damaged local antennae, but reports from across the front revealed the same problem: total blackout. Runners were dispatched, motorcyclists sent through the chaos of the bocage, but the landscape itself was a maze of smoke, rubble, and Allied artillery fire. Hours passed before fragmented messages began to reach headquarters. Too late, too garbled to act on. What no one in that bunker knew was that miles above them, Allied aircraft were transmitting a new kind of weapon. Flying in loose formations, a squadron of modified B-24. Liberators carried experimental jamming systems, developed by the U.S. Army Signal Corps. These transmitters, adapted from the AN/APT-3 carpet radar jammer, had been recalibrated to flood the radio frequencies used by German armored divisions. Each bomber could blanket an area 20 miles wide in high-intensity interference. The operation had been planned for weeks, under the supervision of American engineers from the Signal Intelligence Service, SIS, and British countermeasures specialists. Using captured German equipment, they had identified the precise communication bands of panzer formations. The plan was daring: to silence a division long enough for ground forces to break through. When the jamming began, its effect was instantaneous and absolute. The powerful transmitters aboard the B-24s overwhelmed every signal within range. German transmitters, built for precision rather than resilience, were helpless against the broad, pulsing noise. Inside tanks, crews banged on their radios in frustration. Messages from observation posts vanished mid-transmission. Commanders resorted to colored flares, flag signals, anything to regain control. But by then, The battlefield had dissolved into chaos. Meanwhile, to the south, American units of the U.S. 19th Corps were advancing under cover of the confusion. Infantry and Shermans pushed forward against minimal resistance, bypassing immobilized German armor that had received no orders to reposition. Entire platoons of the Panzer Lehr sat idle, waiting for instructions that would never come. By midday, what should have been an organized German counterattack had become a scattered retreat. Bayerlein, cut off from both his corps command and his forward regiments, could only guess at the situation beyond his bunker. Later, he would describe the scene to Allied interrogators. "We could hear our guns firing, but we could not speak to them. The air was full of noise, like thunder. And then, nothing." For the first time in the war, a German armored division had been rendered operationally blind by electronic means alone. It was not an accident. The Americans had discovered how to weaponize absence itself, to turn silence into strategy. And in that silence, the Panzer Lehr Division ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The Allies advanced, not through brute strength, but through the void where communication once lived. The static that filled German headsets that morning marked a new kind of warfare, one that could unmake an army without touching. It was only the beginning. By afternoon, the fields around Saint-Lô were burning again, this time under the steady thunder of Allied artillery. The Panzer Lehr Division, once Germany's most modern and mechanized force, was no longer a division in any real sense. It was a collection of isolated units, each fighting blind, each unaware of what the others were doing. From the air, Allied pilots could see the confusion below. Tanks idled in open fields, half hidden behind trees. Supply trucks bunched up on narrow roads, unable to receive new coordinates. A few vehicles tried to move, only to blunder into Allied fire or minefields. The Wehrmacht's deadly precision, its synchronized, clockwork movement, had turned into a blur of hesitation and error. The silence was deafening. See, American signal intelligence teams monitoring the jamming frequencies watched their instruments flicker with satisfaction. The interference curve was holding steady. The German channels, usually alive with coded chatter, were flat. At 13:20 hours, the U.S. 19th Corps launched its main assault. Infantry from the 30th Division moved through the bocage, supported by Sherman tanks and artillery from the 2nd Armored Division. What they expected was a fierce, organized counterattack from the Panzer Lehr's armored spearhead. What they met instead was disarray. Without communication, the German defenses could not coordinate fire. Individual units fought bravely, ambushing tanks at close range, defending crossroads, holding hedgerows to the last man. But without synchronized support, their effectiveness crumbled. One battery might fire for hours on a target that no longer existed, while another sat silent, awaiting an order lost to the static. Every minute of radio silence translated into ground gained. In the skies above, the jamming aircraft continued their slow circuits, their heavy bombers carrying no explosives, only generators and antenna arrays. The crews called them ghost ships, flying fortresses that fought with waves instead of bullets. They watched through their small observation windows as smoke rose from below. A battle they were shaping, but would never see. The Germans, still unaware of the exact cause of their communication collapse, resorted to desperate measures. Messengers were dispatched through the fire lines. Flares were fired to signal fallback points. But as the day dragged on, the chaos only deepened. Divisional headquarters attempted to switch to alternate frequencies, but each one was immediately engulfed by the same metallic roar. The Allies were listening, adapting, and matching every shift. The jamming teams had studied their enemy too well. By late afternoon, Bayerlein made the agonizing decision to withdraw his division from the front lines. He could no longer command his units effectively. The Panzer Lehr, designed for mobility and coordination, had been reduced to scattered groups of survivors retreating through the ruins of villages they once defended. For the Germans, it was an invisible defeat. There was no great battle, no decisive clash of tanks. The division wasn't destroyed, it was disconnected, and in modern warfare, disconnection meant death. The Allied ground commanders scarcely realized in that moment how significant the event was. For them, it was simply a successful offensive. For the scientists who had engineered the jamming operation, it was proof that the electromagnetic spectrum could decide wars. In the following days, field reports began to circulate among Allied headquarters describing unexplained failures in German coordination. British analysts in London cross-referenced these with intelligence intercepts, or rather, the absence of them. Where German signals traffic had once been heavy, there was now silence. The conclusion was inescapable. The Americans had achieved the first large-scale, tactical radio kill in military history. When German engineers later examined their damaged equipment, they were stunned. The radios were intact, the circuits unburned. Nothing was broken, yet nothing had worked. The realization spread slowly through the German command structure. The Allies had not destroyed their machines. They had simply rendered them meaningless. In the following weeks, fragments of the Panzer Lehr Division would continue to fight. First at Le Désert, then at Mortain, and finally in the retreat across the Seine. But the division would never again operate as a coherent unit. Its nerve system had been severed once, and that cut was permanent. Years later, after the war, captured German officers would recall the day when their radios screamed and died. They would describe the fear, not of enemy tanks or aircraft, but of nothingness, the emptiness of the air, the collapse of sound, the silence that erased their command. It was, as one German signals officer later told his interrogators, as if the air itself had turned against us. That silence, engineered in American laboratories and broadcast from silver bombers high above the clouds, had rewritten the laws of warfare. And for the first time, German scientists realized that their certainty had been their undoing. From that day onward, the Reich would scramble to catch up, deploying emergency anti-jamming units, new filters, and signal shifts. But the damage was done. A single signal had shown the world that the battlefield of the future would not be measured in miles or meters, but in megahertz. When the smoke cleared over Normandy, the map of France looked different, not because of territory alone, but because of what had just been proven. For the Allies, the operation that crippled the Panzer Lehr Division was more than a tactical success. It was a revelation. Control the spectrum, and you control the battlefield. Reports from field commanders flooded back to Chef, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, describing something unusual. Entire German formations had seemed frozen, unable to respond to artillery or armor thrusts. Units surrendered in groups, not because they were encircled, but because their chain of command had vanished. In the quiet corridors of Allied intelligence centers, engineers and analysts gathered around radio intercept logs, examining the data. They compared hours of transmission silence with ground reports from the same moments. The pattern was unmistakable. Wherever the new jamming frequencies had been deployed, German coordination had collapsed. For the American engineers who had built those devices, the ones who had once been dismissed as radio hobbyists by skeptical generals, it was vindication. They had spent months refining the mathematics of interference, studying captured German equipment, and testing prototypes in hidden hangars from England to North Africa. Now, their work had changed the course of an entire campaign. But for the Germans, the aftermath was chaos. When the remnants of Panzer Lehr retreated eastward, they left behind a landscape strewn with broken antennas, crushed signal trucks, and smashed radio sets. Field commanders, desperate to preserve morale, claimed that the interference had been caused by faulty crystals or unfavorable weather conditions. But among the technical corps, the truth was spreading. The Allies had found a way to reach into the electromagnetic domain and turn it off. By early August 1944, Allied intelligence estimated that German tactical radio usage had dropped by nearly 60% across northern France. Entire divisions reverted to wired communications, running field lines through ditches and hedgerows like it was 1918 again. Messengers carried paper orders on motorcycles and bicycles. In the Wehrmacht's once mechanical war machine, the clockwork precision was breaking down. In Berlin, alarm bells rang through the technical directorates of the Luftwaffe and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Scientists from Telefunken, Lorenz, and Siemens were summoned to crisis meetings. They reviewed captured Allied jamming reports, interrogated survivors, and replayed recorded transmissions. The result was shocking. The jamming frequencies had been precisely matched to German modulation patterns. It wasn't random noise, it was engineered silence. For a nation that had prided itself on technological superiority, it was humiliation. Dr. Wilhelm Runge, one of Germany's leading radar engineers, later admitted in a post-war interview that the Americans had outthought us. Not outbuilt, not outfought. Outthought. Meanwhile, in the Allied world, quiet celebrations took place behind closed doors. In England, at a secure RAF base near Bletchley, scientists raised glasses of weak tea to the Normandy blackout. In Washington, General Hap Arnold's air staff noted that for the first time, an enemy division had been defeated through control of the airwaves rather than the air. The implications were profound. A single jamming wave, invisible, weightless, had proven as devastating as 1,000 bombs. The idea that a machine could be rendered useless not by destruction, but by silence, was revolutionary. From that point forward, the war would never again be fought solely with steel. It would be fought with signals. The Germans scrambled to respond. Emergency directives ordered new frequency-hopping systems, tighter encryption, and manual relays to bypass jamming. But these were patchwork fixes, introduced too late. The Allies were already evolving, deploying airborne radar jammers, night fighter interference units, and countermeasures so sophisticated that they could blind entire radar networks from miles away. The electromagnetic war had begun in earnest, and the first casualty was certainty. The same German officers who had once laughed at American technical experiments now watched their divisions paralyzed by something they couldn't see. In their after-action reports, one line kept recurring. Enemy interference of unknown type rendered all communications impossible. The unknown had become their deadliest enemy. From the ashes of the Normandy fields, both sides began preparing for the next phase, a war not of bullets and tanks, but of invisible waves. The Allies were already building what they called electronic warfare divisions. The Maideen, Germans were trying to catch up. The race for control of the spectrum had begun. By autumn 1944, the lessons of the Normandy blackout had spread far beyond the battlefield. In Allied command centers from London to Washington, new committees were formed to study what had happened to the Panzer Lehr Division and how to replicate it. The British called it signal denial warfare. The Americans gave it a sharper name. Electronic Countermeasures, or ECM, for the first time in military history, silence had become a weapon. At the same time, German high command was struggling to understand how to defend against something it could barely detect. Laboratories that had once worked on radar and guided missiles were now diverted toward developing anti-jamming devices. Telefunken and Lorenz engineers experimented with rapid frequency switching, but their prototypes were crude, unreliable, and impossible to deploy in numbers before the war's end. The Reich's propaganda machine, of course, never mentioned the event. The reports from Panzer Lehr's communications collapse were quietly classified under unverified field disturbances. But among the technical officers who served there, the memory would never fade. They had seen modern war's nervous system, communication, shut down completely. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, small laboratories that had once operated in obscurity were suddenly elevated to strategic importance. The men who had built the jamming systems were summoned to Washington and London to brief generals and ministers. Some of them, mathematicians, radio engineers, even amateur inventors, could hardly believe it. They had spent their careers working with equations and coils, not guns and armor. Yet their equations had stopped one of Germany's elite armored divisions. It marked a subtle but irreversible shift in how war would be fought. The battlefield was no longer only a matter of terrain or logistics. It was also one of frequency. Military historians later described this moment as the birth of the electronic battlefield. The months following the operation, Allied engineers began deploying new jamming techniques against radar systems along the French coast. German night fighter control centers suddenly went dark, their radar screens glowing with false echoes. Luftwaffe pilots launched into the night and found themselves blinded, chasing phantom contacts that didn't exist. What had started as a single signal over Normandy had now become a doctrine, a systematic, scientific campaign to dominate the airwaves. The irony was not lost on those who remembered the early years of the war. Back in 1939 and 1940, it had been the Germans who pioneered electronic warfare, with radar-guided bombers, radio-controlled weapons, and beam navigation. The Allies had played catch-up for years. Now, the roles had reversed. Captured German officers were stunned when Allied interrogators casually mentioned carpet jamming, mandrel, and window, code names for operations that had blinded entire portions of the Luftwaffe radar network. It was clear that the Allies had built not just better weapons, but a theory of how to fight without being seen, heard, or tracked. In one debriefing after the war, a senior German radar officer confessed, "We underestimated them. We thought their machines were clumsy, their science unsophisticated, but they learned faster than we could recover." The collapse of Panzer Lehr's communication net had been the warning. The rest of the war was the consequence. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, German communications were a shadow of what they had once been. The Great Wehrmacht, once known for precision and discipline, was now struggling to coordinate even routine maneuvers. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, wrote bitterly in one of his final reports, "We are deaf in the field." He wasn't exaggerating. Entire divisions operated without clear orders for days. The once feared German artillery, dependent on precise radio coordination, often fired blindly or too late. Tanks arrived at empty crossroads where the battle had already passed them by. It wasn't just defeat by superior numbers. It was defeat by disconnection. And for the Allied scientists watching from their hidden laboratories, the meaning was clear. War had entered a new era, one fought as much in silence as in fire. By VEE Day, when the guns finally fell quiet, another kind of weapon had already been born. In the laboratories of MIT, Cambridge, and Teddington, engineers were already designing the next generation of systems: radar, counter-radar, signal versus signal. The electromagnetic battlefield would only grow more complex. The age of electronic warfare had begun, and it had started not with an explosion, but with a whisper that erased a division. In the end, no monument stands for the men who silenced the air. There are no medals for the engineers who waged a war of waves and static. Yet their invisible victory reshaped the nature of combat more profoundly than any tank or bomb ever could. The collapse of the Panzer Lehr Division was not just the failure of a German army unit, it was the end of an era. The industrial war of engines, armor, and gunfire was giving way to a new kind of struggle, one of information, interference, and control. That single day in Normandy, when German radios screamed and died, marked the dawn of a weapon without a face. A weapon that could not be seen, touched, or heard, yet could paralyze entire armies. In the years that followed, every major power on Earth would study what had happened. The Americans formalized their research into vast institutions, the foundations of the NSA and modern electronic warfare command. The British expanded their radar and countermeasure programs. The Soviets, watching closely, began their own experiments in radio masking. The battlefield had forever changed. From Korea to Vietnam, from the Falklands to the Persian Gulf, the same silent science that began in the hedgerows of France would guide aircraft, disrupt missiles, and shield fleets. And behind it all, the same principle endured. Control the signal, and you control the war. For the German scientists who once mocked the crude simplicity of American technology, the irony was cruel. They had underestimated not the machines, but the minds behind them. Innovation, it turned out, was not born from arrogance, but from necessity. And on that quiet day in Normandy, necessity had spoken, not in the roar of engines, but in the hum of an invisible wave that swept through the sky and left one of Germany's proudest divisions stranded in silence. That silence still echoes. Through every radar screen, every encrypted transmission, every satellite that watches the Earth below. Because long after the tanks rusted and the guns fell silent, the war for the airwaves never ended. It merely changed frequency.